One of the funniest things about pro wrestling is how people act like the controversial nature of certain storylines, and the behavior of many realistic heels throughout the history of the business is any different from any other fictional form of art. People critical of the industry say that because many wrestlers portray versions of themselves, there's strong potential they're putting their own personal views into the characters' promos and so on. But how are the storylines and promos in wrestling any different than a writer, a human being, sitting behind the writing on the page of a screenplay? That writer's politics and their social views, and their emotional intelligence, has just as much chance of bleeding through into their art as any wrestler's personal identity. Now, many criticisms of wrestling are valid. As a fan, I'm critical of the things I don't like in wrestling, the same as I am with literature and film and anything else. However, criticisms like I've already addressed, such as that wrestling's fair game, while literature and film, etc., are beyond reproach when it comes to separating lines between reality and fiction, usually belie a critic's desire to denigrate pro wrestling rather than legitimately engage with it as an art form. Where I'm headed with my gripe about unfair criticisms of pro wrestling is yet again to a parallel with the world of theater. See, most of what we think of as carny wrestling nonsense has an origin, or an adjacent root of some kind, in the world of theater. If you think Vince McMahon or Eric Bischoff or the dreaded Vince Russo, or any of the other madmen promoters of wrestling over the years, are unique in their ability to do controversial, awful, strange, and nasty things, then you'll be amazed, as well as likely horrified, by what writers and directors have done on the stage. Old Bill Shakespeare himself took time away from writing his typical masterworks to dip his toes into the lurid. Titus Andronicus, even by modern standards, is a shocking piece of fiction. It's as if several modern writers for the stage took a cue from Shakespeare, hoping to shock their audiences and engage minds while disturbing them. Playwrights like Edward Bond, Sarah Kane, and Martin McDonough have all carried the torch of Titus Andronicus, and all the other staged horrors of the past before it. The big difference between those playwrights and the puppet masters of the squared circles is quality. While Bond, Kane, and McDonough have all written what I'd consider masterpieces, McMahon, Bischoff, Russo, and others in promotions apart from WWE/F and WCW in the wrestling world have routinely used controversy poorly, resulting in laughable, cringeworthy, and outright offensive material that'll either be totally forgotten or remain infamous long after we perish. In this video, I'm going to look at the works of Bond, Kane, and McDonough, then parallel their extreme themes in the theater with extreme themes in wrestling. A drastic comparison that'll provide as many laughs as it will oofs. There's simply no way to talk about theater exploring extreme themes without mentioning Edward Bond. His 1965 play Saved looked long and hard at poverty in London by telling a tale about young people living on a council estate and collecting welfare benefits. The play itself has perhaps been eclipsed by the controversy surrounding it, at least until decades after it initially premiered. For instance, in one scene, a group of the young folk tease a baby, escalating into violence before they stone the child to death in its carriage. Bond's intent on showing such terrible imagery was not to exploit it and create a blood-spattered baby to show gruesomely to the audience. His intent was to be shockingly serious about the results of what can happen when young people are left behind by their parents and by society, and what that sometimes can lead to in certain cases. Bond once said, "If you can't face Hiroshima in the theater, you'll eventually end up in Hiroshima itself." And this is not just true on a grand scale, it's true of issues like Bond tackles in Saved. The same sentiment goes today with issues like abortion or teen pregnancy, which need to be seen in fiction to dispel conservative fantasies about controlling women's bodies and right-wing conspiracy theories. Any sensitive, misunderstood social or political issues are ripe for proper representation on screen, and if, as a public, we're too squeamish to deal with them fictionally, we're at a disadvantage already when it comes to dealing with it in reality. Of course there is a line, but Bond walked that line quite well, and never, in my opinion, went too far beyond it. And then came along someone like Sarah Kane, a habitual and phenomenal line stepper, whose own plays challenge socio-political issues with psychological and visceral horror alike. Though Kane wrote a handful of plays, she, like Bond before her, is infamously known for one play in particular, and for her it was the very first play she wrote, Blasted. Kane's Blasted was performed in full for the first time in 1995. It wasn't long before people were utterly horrified by the play, and Bond himself would publicly support Kane and the playwright's work. The play depicts everything from anal rape to the cannibalism of a baby and various other atrocities, none of which is for the faint of heart. The play critiques war, the media, men, and more, using all the vivid, sick imagery to full effect. In the hands of another artist, these kinds of things could and would likely end up as shock for shock's sake. Whereas Kane's play gets to the hyper-reality of a world torn apart by capitalism, industrialization, and out-of-control military powers. Martin McDonagh's The Pillow Man is perhaps a perfect culmination of the work Bond and Kane were doing in their own respective ways, in that the play uses disturbing, shocking fiction to engage with political and social realities. The controversial play is about a writer named Katurian who gets arrested by two detectives due to his eerie stories resembling a bunch of recent child murders. Katurian's ordeal is one that examines state control and censorship as much as it does the way writers create controversial, disturbing fiction by channeling their own traumas. The fact The Pillow Man wasn't treated like Blasted or Saved doesn't mean it wasn't controversial. Plenty of critics have torn it apart, and you'll certainly not see McDonagh's play at the Regional Theatre Festival this year. It's also a hopeful sign that in spite of modern society's flaws, we've somehow moved forward in our collective understanding of how art uses shock for intelligent ends. And while there is a lot of trash out there masquerading as fiction, there are so many artists, like a Bond or a Kane or a McDonagh, have used the gruesome, the grotesque, the horrific, the controversial to make statements about life and the society we've created. If only wrestling shockmasters were able to hone their instincts for the controversial better, then we wouldn't have so many instances of bad extreme themes surrounding the squared circle. Even with all the money and all those writers, WWF/E has produced so much ill-advised garbage. And what about all those wrestling promotions without that money to hire professional writers, along with all the other bells and whistles? Shit Show is actually putting it nicely. The horrific acts committed against an infant in Bond Saved were in service of examining the wasted youths of those stuck in dire socio-economic conditions. They weren't being used solely to shock or anger. Then there's the WWE and the twisted mind of Vince McMahon. The scene from Bond's play featuring the baby's murder reminds me of a much less thoughtful moment from a feud between Kane, Lita, and Gene Snitsky. There was an angle which featured Lita miscarrying her unborn baby after Snitsky hit Kane with a chair, knocking the big red machine into Lita. Later, Snitsky would spin a catchphrase out of this event. Perhaps in the most tasteless moment of all, Snitsky punts a baby while mocking Lita's miscarriage. What? Again, Saved used its uncomfortable baby scene as a confrontation with social issues, whereas WWE and Vince McMahon just thought it was cheap heat. Thing is, cheap heat can be great when done right, while this miscarriage and mockery did nothing but exploit actual issues through which many mothers have suffered. Then again, WWE has never been great to women apart from recently, and still it continues to mess up on occasion. I didn't make mention of the 2014 play Dry Land by Ruby Ray Spiegel in the introduction. It's worth mentioning here after Snitsky and the Baby. Spiegel's play addresses abortion and lack of access to safe abortions, and the prospect of teen motherhood, all with seriousness and a keen eye for humor. In contrast, WWF/E has played miscarriages as drama and then exploited them in various ways, multiple times in the company's relatively recent history, rather than telling any kind of compelling story about women's issues. The WWF at one point went so far as to have Terry Runnels do a miscarriage storyline, later revealed to be a lie she concocted. This is in no way advocating for pro wrestling to start tackling social issues again, at least not when it comes to storylines. It's merely a compare-contrast of how these issues get confronted in different art forms, and why it's usually better off if the wrestling world steers away from bothering to attempt such sensitive confrontations. Leave the progressive action to pushing more women in wrestling, more queer people in wrestling, more trans people in wrestling. We return to Sarah Kane and her graphic, disturbing talent, in contrast with the graphic, disturbing themes WWE has tried to use in angles and segments over the years, notably in the years after the Attitude Era, when supposedly the company was toning things down. In the previously mentioned Blasted, Sarah Kane takes a brutal look at the social and political consequences of rape, and the play largely focuses in on misogyny and the treatment of women regarding rape. It's difficult yet necessary, at least in the hands of a playwright trying to force audiences into reckoning with such subjects. It's not so necessary when, on an episode of SmackDown, Heidenreich kidnapped announcer Michael Cole in the middle of another group of wrestlers' match, and whisked him off somewhere backstage, and then it was implied the much bigger man was raping the smaller one. Heidenreich pushes himself up against Cole, who's trapped against a wall, and repeatedly thrusts into him, breathing heavily, and talking about how he'll give you what you want. It is a wildly messed up moment in the history of WWF/E, and it's amazing the segment ever made it to air. Kane's Blasted might seem exploitative at times, but it has at its core an aim to attack society for all the destruction, from the individual and the physical to the national level it allows and causes. WWE's SmackDown used a rape angle with such tastelessness it's hard to imagine anybody involved could vouch for it being on TV. Not to say this was the first time McMahon and WWE ever dipped their toes into using rape as a plot device. Only a couple years before the Hayden rape angle, McMahon concocted an utterly strange and disgusting moment to throw fuel onto the fire of a feud between Kane and Triple H. And you know where I'm going with this. The uber infamous Katie Vick story. For those who know, you unfortunately already know. For those who don't, in a taped segment, Triple H, wearing Kane's mask, crawled into a casket with a corpse meant to be a dead Katie Vick, then had sex with it before saying, "I screwed your brains out," and tossing gelatin posing as brains at the camera. Even worse is that Bruce Pritchard on his Something to Wrestle podcast with Conrad Thompson once revealed they filmed in a real funeral home and there was an actual viewing going on across the way from them, making this yucky moment feel all the more hideous. Like the other mentions, this WWE moment doesn't do any social or political work like Kane or Bond, it's just exploitation for cheap laughs and thrills. What's sadder is that this wasn't laughable and it wasn't thrilling, so it was simple exploitation without any payoff. A disaster of morality in the name of creating ratings. No stranger to Vince McMahon. Finally, I want to compare Kane's play Cleansed and how it examines suicide in relation to another ill-conceived WWE story. That's right, Tim White's Lunchtime Suicides. All of Sarah Kane's work looked at the raw truths behind violent acts, whether war, sexual assault, abuse, suicide, etc. Though Cleansed isn't centered around a suicide, the play features a character, Robin, who kills himself. And the play itself looks at everything from loneliness and love to those nasty acts of violence with which Kane was generally preoccupied. A hard 180-degree turn here as we look at WWE when they featured referee Tim White in a recurring segment called Lunchtime Suicides, involving White wanting to unalive himself but never quite getting the job done. There was no real reason for these segments other than giving White, once Andre the Giant's right-hand man on the road, an on-screen character apart from refereeing matches. The problem is that while Cleansed looked at the isolation of societal outcasts, and in Robin's case, how that can lead people to depression and potentially suicide, WWE's tasteless suicide sketches made light of people with major depression and suicidal tendencies, treating the act of suicide, or not being able to complete it, like the punchline of a terrible joke. Just one of many ways WWE has consistently returned to its lowbrow nature, always choosing to use serious situations as fodder for bad storylines, or even worse, laughable storylines. Sarah Kane drew plenty of harsh criticism for her work, but the plays were at least actually trying to make progress by pushing uncomfortable, extreme themes into the public's awareness. Problem is, WWE has never tried to do any real social or political legwork with their use of extreme themes, like other forms of fiction, only seeking to boost ratings and get people talking about what happened last night on Raw or SmackDown, for better or worse. And of course, WWE is not the only culprit. Lots of other promotions, from AEW to indie promotions, have done slightly insensitive, if not outright insensitive, storylines or promos. And this is one of the problems that pro wrestling has overall, in not being considered one of the great art forms. Maybe if wrestlers and promoters took a little bit more care with some of the very serious stories they tell, then maybe wrestling could be elevated to a much greater art form. I have to admit, lest I make myself a fool, there is one way that wrestling, apart from theme, can bridge into real life and become not only controversial, but dangerous. And that's when it comes to the actual physicality of wrestling. You can do all the disturbing, outrageous, and offensive stories known to man, but nobody's being physically injured. When hardcore wrestling's extreme stunt work goes too far or wrong, it has an actual physical effect. For all the great extreme themes in wrestling Paul Heyman brought to the world with Extreme Championship Wrestling, there's also the one night that will forever live in infamy with wrestling fans: the evening of the mass transit incident. During an ECW show, an underage wrestler named Mass Transit filled in for another wrestler, but unbeknownst to Heyman or anyone else who mattered, Kid lied about his age using falsified documents. What resulted was the young wrestler ending up across the ring from New Jack, who already felt slighted by Mass Transit before the match, and proceeded to slice the boy open. There's little footage available today, but what does exist shows Mass Transit bleeding like a faucet, as New Jack hops on the mic telling the crowd, Jack was actually acquitted of charges after a court ruled that Transit, real name Eric Koulas, knew the risks involved and knew how to wrestle. But the incident is something Heyman would probably rather forget, even if it's kind of a claim to fame for New Jack. Now, Heyman can't really be blamed for the Mass Transit massacre, a better, more apt name, because the kid lied about his age and got in way too deep all on his own. We can certainly kind of blame New Jack, who didn't need to carve the kid up, and definitely not to the extent he did during the match. The important thing to note about the mass transit incident is that these types of things can happen in pro wrestling where fictional stories are passed off as real in conjunction with physical violence, especially in the days of kayfabe, when someone could be getting destroyed and certain people would let it happen to supposedly protect the business. It's even more able to happen when the wrestling is hardcore. There are more events than just the mass transit debacle in wrestling that show how a fictional presentation combined with extreme physicality and violence can result in not only accidents and injury, but also in plain old poor decision making in terms of what an audience is hoping, or more importantly paying, to see.
Jesus!
Real quick, we'll take a detour to Combat Zone Wrestling, CZW. For those who already know, CZW boasts all kinds of weaponry and extreme violence that most other American companies shy away from, at least in the mainstream. Recently, GCW has pushed that envelope. CZW is certainly not mainstream. It's pretty well known though in the wrestling world, and some of WWE as well as AEW's biggest stars made their way up through the small promotion on their journey up the ladder. Either way, CZW is infamous for the blood and violence it encourages, way beyond the level of even the most hardcore wrestling companies. Still, somehow, occasionally even CZW misjudges what its own audience are looking for. Such as when John Zandig, founder and former owner of CZW, did a meat hook stunt during a 2003 pay-per-view called Redefined. It went pretty bad, leaving a bloody Zandig hanging while the crew tried to rush fans out of the building in hopes of getting their boss down without breaking kayfabe. Not that any of the fans were keen on watching a massive man hang from hooks, bleeding profusely. It's ironic to some that fans are hungry for the regular extreme violence of CZW but shy away from Zandig's meat hook spot. Not to me, because things got too serious, and Danzig wasn't so much selling a spot as he was suffering through a suspension gone wrong. By the same token as looking at violent moments in hardcore wrestling that went a bit too far, we can view action films and the increasingly dangerous stunts that continue to be performed today in the same light as anything nasty that's occurred in wrestling. Sadly, and most recently the situation on the film Rust, resulting in a tragic, preventable death, shows us how the film industry isn't immune to these kinds of awful events either. And hardcore wrestling has plenty of good material. It's not all blood and guts, and it isn't all violence without any character development. Paul Heyman did amazing things for the characters he created, and those that already existed for him to nurture in ECW. I could go on for ages about ECW's awesome characters and storylines. Two major ones come to mind, in sticking with the idea of extreme themes. First, there's the Raven vs. Sandman feud, in which the Sandman's actual wife and child were involved. ECW played off divorce and custody battles, pulling real-life themes into the wrestling world like never before, doubly so because it was Sandman's actual family, not a stand-in acting family. All that real-world emotion combined with extreme violence, kendo sticks, chairs, tables, ladders, even a mock crucifixion with a barbed wire crown of thorns, made for powerful storytelling. Some of the stories told in ECW, like the Raven and the Sandman feud, brought grown men to tears at times. That's because it was real and it was good, exploring actual social issues without making a mockery of them, usually the result when WWF/E was doing it, whereas Heyman had the sense to not create too much cartoonish content. It's not saying he didn't create any, just not too much. The second event, and for me the most important, is Mick Foley chastising fans for the Kane Dewey sign. Dewey's one of Mick's children, and at the time the kid was only 4 years old. So when Mick saw a sign advocating taking a cane to his baby boy, he decided to cut vicious promos on the fans and, most hilariously, deliver traditional, bad wrestling matches to draw their ire.
Jenny, he's hardcore! He's hardcore!
The reason why I feel Mick's storyline here is most important to ECW and how it confronted real-world issues is because it was all in response to Foley deeming the ECW crowds too bloodthirsty. He was giving his body over to the fans and they were not thinking about the actual people behind the extreme wrestling, treating real people as characters instead of human beings with feelings, personal lives, families, and broken down bodies. This storyline was Mick and Heyman actually looking at their industry and ECW's specific brand of wrestling with a critical eye of their own. A kind of metafictional response to the way hardcore wrestling fans were treating the product and those involved. The Mick Foley storyline and the Sandman vs. Raven feud in ECW made all those involved, including Heyman, bigger stars, and showed how the company was willing to shoot for themes that were as wild as the wrestling and the violence. Ultimately, this video was comparing Paul Heyman's boundary-pushing wrestling storylines with Sarah Kane's disturbing, eye-opening plays, looking into how they were both important in their respective worlds. Heyman revolutionized the world of wrestling, considering that WWF/E used a lot of what ECW made popular to bolster their Attitude Era approach of shock and awe. Also, ECW and its stars were the catalyst for people like Nick Gage and other deathmatch wrestlers to go a step further, taking what Heyman and his band of fearless wrestlers did to the next insane level. Similarly, in the arts world, Kane's disturbing yet important plays were a major influence on in-your-face theater during the 1990s, a movement that grew out of Great Britain, focused on being aggressively confrontational in its subject matter, with the aim of affecting an audience to a greater degree, often centering on economic, social, and political issues. Kane's Cleansed and Blasted are considered seminal works of in-your-face theater, plays that continue to influence new playwrights around the world. Though not all work like Kane's is good, there are, like wrestling, plenty of bad instances of in-your-face theater. The work like hers and Bond's previously does so much for artists in general, illustrating the power of fiction to provoke genuine thought and how it can be a tool in helping to change minds socially. Most might think Heyman and his ECW roster haven't attained such goals as Kane in her own work. I like to think that him pushing intergender matches, like the bloody brawl between Bill Alfonso and Beulah McGillicuddy, or featuring Luna, was a major, significant precursor for serious women's wrestling in the business. Definitely for the deathmatch and indie wrestling scene, where we see more and more intergender wrestling over the past couple decades. Heyman and Kane each affected their own industries to the point they'll never be forgotten. Certain aspects of wrestling will always be associated with Heyman, just like particular styles in the theater will never lose their association to Kane's brand of confrontational writing. Thankfully, Heyman's still with us, and passing on all his wrestling knowledge to new generations. Kane unfortunately took her own life in 1999 at only 28 years of age. A shining light is that Kane's plays will forever remain in print to inspire future playwrights with her innovative shocks. When done right, extreme themes are as viable on the stage as they are within the squared circle, and vice versa. The socio-political issues we face in real life are always mirrored in fiction because pop culture, fiction or otherwise, becomes ingrained with all aspects of culture, good and bad. When creators and writers, the likes of Kane or Heyman, intentionally engage with real-world issues while taking them seriously, it calls attention to their artistic talent and it forces people to be aware of those issues outside fictional confines. Once again, I repeat, I'm not saying wrestling companies need to be engaging with all manner of issues facing society. I am saying that when they choose to do so, if they actually decide to do it with compassion, intelligence, and self-awareness, they hold the possibility to gain the ratings they seek while simultaneously positively influencing the culture of wrestling and pop culture overall. Revolutionary? No. It's just another facet of morality.
So if I was you, I'd sit down and shut the fuck up!